I've been in therapy for 6 months now, and during this time, I haven't said a single word. Every Monday and Thursday, I sit in Dr. Alwa's office, sucking on the candies she keeps on her desk. She's fresh out of university, living her dream of having her own practice, and somehow, I ended up as her first patient. "How are you today?" she asks after a while, and I just stare at her. "Do you want to talk about it this time?" she adds. But all I give her in return is my blank stare and the sound of the candy being sucked in my mouth. I sit there, trying to finish as many candies as I can in 30 minutes. Last time, it was 42. I unwrap another one and wait for Dr. Alwa to give up. But she's tougher than I thought and recently came up with a new idea. If I didn't want to talk about the traumatic events, I should at least write about them. So here I am, writing about what happened during my exchange year in the USA. Dr. Alwa will never see these words. I'm not doing her that favor. But I have to admit, it somehow feels right to write everything down. It's like throwing up into a trash can. I still feel sick afterward, but at least I've gotten rid of some of the weight. It all started when I got the chance to do an exchange year in the USA. Like most people, I grew up watching American movies and TV shows, and I found the idea of going to high school, playing baseball, and living out the American dream fascinating. So, I applied for the program, did a few interviews, wrote an essay titled "I Have a Dream," and was accepted, not least because my father generously donated a large sum to the school association. Well, with money, you can buy dreams. My mother, as usual, was worried. The loose gun laws, all the school shootings, and the political situation that was tearing the country apart all concerned her. At the time, I convinced her it wasn't as bad as she thought, but looking back, I have to admit she was right. If I had only listened to her, I wouldn't be plagued by nightmares today. In the summer, everything began. I flew to the small town of Hastings in Minnesota, where I stayed with the Smith family. They were an entirely ordinary American family, Father James, Mother Olivia, and their son Eric, who was the same age as me. James worked as a realtor for an insurance company, Olivia was an elementary school teacher, and Eric attended the high school where I would spend the year. They lived in a spacious single-family home that, by German standards, seemed almost as if it were made of papier-mâché. Aside from that, I quickly realized they weren't all that different from my own family. The high school was also similar to my German gymnasium, with one major difference. Community played a much more significant role in American schools. When the school's football team played, everyone showed up to cheer them on, complete with cheerleaders and mascots. In Germany, on the other hand, everyone would just go about their lives after school, independent of the school community. This sense of unity was what I liked most. The first few weeks were exciting, and I gradually adjusted to the new environment. I even went on a date with a girl from my parallel class who lived on our street, the classic girl next door. I was too skinny and slow for the football team, but in baseball, I made a pretty good impression as a hitter and even managed to hit a home run once. The Smiths argued quite often, but it didn't bother me much. At home, we were used to shouting matches as well. Even though my English was improving, I still couldn't quite catch everything they were arguing about. Olivia would complain that James wasn't taking his heart medication and was eating unhealthily. One time, after coming back from a business trip, she found burger sauce on the corner of his mouth and made a scene. James turned bright red, and for a moment, I honestly thought he might have a heart attack right there. But the main source of tension was their son, Eric. He really made life difficult for his parents. When I first arrived, he showed me to my room and casually mentioned that the toilet wasn't working, so I should just use a bucket under the sink instead. I didn't think much of it and did as he suggested, until James came over, looking confused, and asked if this was some kind of German custom not to use the toilet. Another time, Eric took me to the garage and showed me his dad's gun, a Beretta 92. It was the first time I had ever held a gun, and it felt surreal. In Germany, that would have been unimaginable, but for Eric, it seemed perfectly normal. "Want to shoot it?" he asked with a strange grin, watching my unsure reaction. Then he laughed and put the gun away. Another point of conflict was Eric's desire to get his motorcycle license. There was an old bike in the garage that his uncle no longer needed, and Eric wanted it. He could have it, he said, if his parents allowed it and if he got a license. Of course, James and Olivia didn't approve. His mother argued that it was too dangerous, which seemed a bit hypocritical considering the loaded gun in the garage. They argued about it for a long time until Eric eventually lost interest in the bike and gave up. The day it happened, the day I find so hard to write about, was a clear summer day. The night before, I had been sick and had to stay home while Eric went to school. It was probably just a mild stomach bug. By the afternoon, I felt better and helped James in the garden while Olivia prepared dinner. It was a Tuesday and Eric had football practice, so he was usually home by 5 p.m. But he didn't come back and he didn't answer his phone. We ate dinner without him and I could feel Olivia's growing anxiety. "He'll be home soon," I said, trying to calm her, though I didn't truly believe it myself. What happened next burned into my brain like corrosive acid, and every time I close my eyes, I see the door slowly open and a figure enter the living room. It took me several seconds to realize that this something was Eric. His face was covered in blood, his right eye was hanging loose from its socket, and the lower part of his left arm was missing. But what still haunts me in my nightmares to this day, and what Dr. Alwa would consider the reason for my post-traumatic stress disorder, was the fact that Eric no longer had any feet. He merely stumbled around the room on his leg stumps. I can still hear the sound his bones made as he staggered across the room. Clack, clack, clack. Then he collapsed in front of the dinner table. Later in the autopsy, they discovered that this was also the time of his death. Olivia screamed hysterically, and James stared apathetically at the pool of blood spreading beneath his dead son. His face took on the red color of blood. His carotid artery filled up like a balloon. And then, his head hit the table with a loud bang. The police report later cited a myocardial infarction as the cause of death. It wasn't the sneaky burgers that killed him, but the sight of his zombie-like son. Olivia suddenly fell silent as she looked back and forth between the lifeless bodies of her son and her husband. She straightened up and smiled at me. "I'll be right back. Have some more of that meatloaf, darling," she said, and left the room. I tried to turn James over to check if he still had a pulse. When I couldn't, I looked for my cell phone to call the ambulance. That's when Olivia came back. She still had that strange smile on her face. "Please excuse this mess," she said, and only then did I see that she was holding Jaime's gun. She put the Beretta in her mouth. "No!" I shouted. But then the shot rang out. Pieces of her brain splattered in my face and her lifeless body hit the floor, right between Eric and James. I wiped the blood from my face and threw up on the floor, where my vomit mixed with the blood of my host family. When the sheriff arrived with his deputies, I was sitting at the dining table, eating the meatloaf. Why I did that, I still don't know. But Dr. Alwa would probably have some smart-sounding psychological term for it. They arrested me, but the next morning, they let me go once it was clear I had nothing to do with the deaths of the family. Just before I flew back to Germany, the lead investigator called me and explained what had happened that day. Eric had taken the motorcycle from the garage without permission, going for a ride. On the highway, he lost control of the bike on a curve and ended up in oncoming traffic. He collided with a minivan and was severely injured. Then something that resembled a medical phenomenon, often reported by soldiers in war, occurred. Eric's body was under so much stress and flooded with adrenaline that his brain tricked him into thinking everything was fine, that his feet weren't severed, lying on County Highway 55. So, he stood up and walked to where he belonged, home to his mom and dad. James had a heart attack, and Olivia took her own life because she couldn't imagine living without her family. Back in Germany, everything feels alien, as if the world is wrapped in cotton. I see your faces and hear your words, but they no longer mean anything to me. Sometimes I still see Eric with his injuries. On Mondays and Thursdays, he joins me for my sessions with Dr. Alwa. The path takes longer because Eric, without his feet, moves slowly. I stop and wait for him. The brochure for the exchange program promised that the trip to the USA would change my life. In my case, it certainly did. I have had this feeling that my house is cursed in some way for a while now. My dad, and now stepmother, We're wanting to combine households because of rising housing prices and recent divorces on both sides. This house is around an hour from my college and from my job, a fact that was not disclosed to me until after we had moved. It is about 30 minutes from the nearest town with a decent grocery store. You could think about this place as a traditional upper Midwest farmhouse. It sits on about 8 acres of land that we have put a few various animals on and has a heating system reliant on a wood boiler. We bought the place at a really cheap price because it was in a pretty bad state of disrepair. The front and back porches were falling apart to a point where we had to be careful where we stepped or we would snap a board. There was a large above-ground pool near the back door that was covered in moss and had sickly green water in it filled with tadpoles. Large sections of the property had been used as trash dumping sites by the previous owners, where they would dig a hole and bury or burn their trash rather than take it to a dump. The property came with a large, dark-colored wooden barn and a small detached garage, both of which had also seen better days. The house itself wasn't in as bad of a condition as the rest of the property, though it did need quite a bit of work. The upstairs had some really bad linoleum flooring laid down that was once white, but had yellowed with age. Many of the wooden doors in the house had scratches covering them from all angles. The garbage disposal in the sink and the dishwasher didn't work. All of the showers and the master bathtub were covered in an orange film from the high amounts of metal in the well water the house is hooked up to. The entire place also really needed a paint job. The basement below the main house is connected by a rough stairwell to the rest of the house, and a set of metal cellar doors connect it to the front yard. When we first moved in, the basement was almost completely empty. One of the previous owners had ran electricity and water to the basement and had framed 2 bedrooms down there, but never fully finished. It was really unclear from what the realtor would tell us, but apparently failing health and a nasty divorce led to him selling the place after he got the place from the people that used it like a dump. We combined households and moved all of our stuff in over the course of a couple weeks in mid-September, a little over 2 years ago now. My dad and stepmother took the master bedroom, of course, while myself, my newly minted 3 step-siblings, and 4 dogs all squeezed into the other end of the upstairs in 2 bedrooms. We shared a tiny bathroom with a shower that we could barely fit into for a couple months while we worked on all aspects of the property. Thankfully, my new uncle is a carpenter, and he worked downstairs while my dad and I took care of the flooring. My stepbrothers worked on the outside with help from my dad occasionally. Within the first 3 months or so, we were able to make the downstairs bedrooms livable and moved the laundry room downstairs to make another bedroom upstairs. We replaced the old linoleum with some nicer laminate, and everyone finally had some breathing room. The first several signs of things being off with this house all happened during those first few months. When we bought the property, we found some things the previous owner had left behind in the detached garage. He had set up a workbench in there that had some various buckets of nuts, bolts, and screws, and a few empty beer cans. There were also several pictures of him in military uniform, posing for the camera with several others. A few of them had labels across the bottom, mostly stating things like, Camp Such and Such, 1997. It struck us all as kinda odd that he would leave something like this behind, so we put it all in a box for him. We tried to get into contact with him again through the realtor to tell him about the stuff he left behind, but we could never reach him. The next thing that struck me as odd were the seemingly random appliance failures we had all throughout the first few months. When we moved in, we knew that the dishwasher and garbage disposal didn't work, but we thought it was a condition localized to those appliances. The fridge gave out only a few months later. Thankfully, we were able to buy a new one before all of our food went bad. Our replacement dishwasher also only lasted about a month before it gave out as well, and we had to buy another one. The big one here was one of the downstairs chest freezers. The first things that we moved into the new house were our chest freezers, because of course you don't want to leave that kind of thing out. Between our households, we had 3 chest freezers, all filled with food. We moved all 3 of them to the new house's basement pantry and left them there while we worked on moving the rest of our stuff in. Shortly after moving in, we discovered that one of the freezers had stopped working. This turned the entire thing into a sarcophagus of rancid flesh and disease within about 3 days. The first person to open it was one of my stepbrothers, who promptly threw up at the smell. I was thankfully not there for the extraction of that chest freezer, though I know how it ended. They used a backhoe we had rented for cleaning up the yard to pull it out of the basement through the cellar doors. Unfortunately, the bottom of the freezer gave out as well, and rancid meat juice was trailed all over the front yard, giving the entire property a foul smell for weeks that would reappear for a while after when it rained. The pantry was also home to several baby chicks for a couple months that first winter, because my parents decided it would be a good idea to buy a couple dozen of them and a few ducks less than a month away from winter. Chicks can be some of the most fickle animals sometimes, as we learned fairly quickly. If we set that lamp a little too high, we would come back to 3 dead chicks the next morning. Set it a little too low, and you get dead chicks. We ultimately lost 8 in total before the weather warmed up enough and we could move them to the newly built chicken coop outside. Of course, by that point, the remaining chickens were large enough that we didn't have to worry about temperature swings as much. Today, we have about 10 chickens or so after a few were picked off by a fox. One hen had an egg lodged in her and died, and the rooster was killed by my dad for attacking one of my stepmother's grandchildren. The ducks met a more mysterious fate. We have an outside 20 by 20 dog pen from the previous owner that we repaired and turned into a home for the ducks. We had them for about a year or so until all 6 of them disappeared overnight, never to be seen again. The next animal-related venture we have had at this house is the 2 goats and the rabbits that were bought to be pets for the grandchildren. After visiting the breeder with the intent to buy 1 goat, my stepmother came home with a brother and sister pair that she named Bonnie and Clyde, after the famous outlaws. A similar event happened when she went to a farming goods store and came back with a small rabbit she had named Oreo because he was black and white. The rabbit was kept outside in a small pen for a while and eventually went missing after the cage was left open one evening. The male goat, Clyde, was found dead one morning after being in seemingly fine health. Bonnie is still alive and well, thankfully. The various farm animals to me were disheartening, of course, but not anything that I dwelled on for too long. The losses that I have felt the most since moving in here were 2 of our dogs, Buster and Susie. These 2 were my childhood dogs, the kind that every dog person remembers for the rest of their lives. We got Susie when I was around 10 and rescued Buster when I was about 12. Susie was a Jack Russell Terrier, which is a small dog breed of about 20 pounds or so. Buster, on the other hand, was a Shar-Pei Labrador, probably some other stuff mix. Looking back on it now, it was insanely cruel how both of them passed. A few months after we moved in, around February or so, we let Buster out with the other dogs to go do their business outside. This was something that we did 1,000 times before and since, with a little supervision. One of my stepbrothers let them all out, and only 3 came back, Buster being the odd one out. We searched for him for hours that night, and I called off work the next day to search for him as well. We combed everything within a half mile, and even checked all of the roadsides just in case the worst had come. He was gone for over a week, which was the worst part. I would catch myself looking at our property and searching on my way to and from work and college. That week, we had a terrible thunderstorm and snow, and we all feared that he was gone forever. He then just reappeared one morning following our other dogs back in after we had let them out again on a Sunday morning. He had lost a lot of weight and spent the next couple days resting in my parents' room. I cried because I was so relieved to have him back. We knew that he was around 14 or 15 years old, so we knew every day we had with him from then on was a gift. However, that gift started becoming a curse fairly quickly. Buster had always been a very sweet dog before, the type that would come rest his head on your arm while you were watching TV just so he could get some pets. He rarely made noise in general unless somebody unknown was in our yard. After that incident, though, he became a very aggressive dog. He started picking fights with another one of our dogs regularly, and one fight got so bad he needed stitches. He would growl at people coming near him, even me, who he had never shown any aggression towards since we had gotten him several years before. He started smelling terrible, and his skin became oily. We took him to the vet a couple times, and they simply stated that it was likely just because he was old, since there was nothing truly wrong with him. We had to keep him separated from the other dogs for the last few months of his life. Susie, on the other hand, was a surprise. She had always been in good health, and was a very energetic dog. Her favorite pastimes were to catch vermin in our yard and bring it to us like a cat, or to play fetch with her favorite red rubber ball. She was also a couple years younger than Buster, so we thought that she would outlive him by around the same amount or more, since she was a smaller dog. We knew something was up with her when she wouldn't run and play anymore outside. We thought at first it was because it was cold out and she hated the cold, but then she developed a wet cough. We took her to the vet, where we found out her lungs were eaten up with cancer. We had to put her down later that afternoon, and less than 2 weeks later, Buster had a stroke and we had to put him down too. It wasn't lost on me that both dogs went out in seemingly the worst way possible for their personalities, with Buster going from sweet to aggressive, and Susie, the dog that loves to run and play, not being able to breathe. Our other 2 dogs, namely Olive, the black lab, has had a bit of a story at this house too. He will often roam around and find things that have been buried in the yard or local roadkill. Somehow he hasn't gotten sick from any of the roadkill he has eaten, even after turning our yard into a massive bone storage facility. He will also bring back random objects he has found in the yard. At first, these things were innocuous, like whipped cream cans or pizza boxes from the previous homeowners. After we destroyed the decrepit pool and the garage where we found the previous owner's stuff, the things he would bring to us changed. He would start bringing dildos and knives up to the porch, mysterious papers with the names of people we had never met written in red ink. The final straw for us was when we found him ripping apart a small onesie meant for a baby that was covered in dried blood. Afterward, we started combing the yard for anything showing up and used that information to find the dump sites and burned them. The strange occurrences have also happened to several of us while driving since moving in. I learned to drive and had been driving for around 4 years or so before moving into this house and had never had an accident. My stepmother and 3 stepbrothers had all similarly never been in an accident in many combined years of driving before moving in here. Less than 2 months after moving in, I fishtailed my pickup on an icy day into a concrete barrier and destroyed it. The oldest of my stepbrothers almost died in a car accident while drunk driving. Everyone else has either hit a deer or had mysterious car problems. The car I bought after crashing my pickup met its end when a buck jumped out in front of me 2 miles from our house. My stepmother's car met a similar end in almost the same spot. My middle stepbrother had a deer hit his truck's door. My youngest stepbrother has hit 3 deer total and has had car troubles the entire time he has lived here. To top all of this off, personal tragedy has struck us 3 times in the last few years. First, my mother finally lost her almost 15-year battle with an autoimmune disease. Then, my paternal grandfather was diagnosed with mouth cancer and passed away only a few months later. This event caused a family schism that has resulted in a mutual cutting off of that smaller side of the family. Additionally, it was found out that my uncle had been leading a double life against my aunt for the last several years, and that has led to an ugly divorce. All of this, plus stress from work, has led to my dad now starting to have a bit of a drinking problem. I personally had a relationship with a high school sweetheart that slowly fell apart at the seams until we finally broke up. Now, farm animals and pets passing, leftover belongings, family problems, and local wildlife taking out all of our cars can be explained as a combination of coincidence and horrible misfortune. Everything that I have talked about so far is seemingly rational, albeit weird. What I haven't brought up yet are the events that have me convinced that his house is either haunted or cursed. Shortly after moving in, we used the wooden barn that was on the property as a storage spot for a lot of our extra stuff that we couldn't keep inside due to lack of space. This barn wasn't in the greatest shape, but it had no leaks from the roof and showed no signs of falling in anytime soon. We put our lawnmowers, a small generator, a lot of lawn implements, and a few plastic tubs full of personal items out there. I distinctly remember my stepmother asking me to put a couple of plastic tubs with personal items relating to the childhood of each of her children in them in that barn. Pictures, blankets, scrapbooks, and several other items were in those tubs. The very next day, I woke up to my alarm at around 8 a.m., took a shower, and got ready for college as per usual. I went outside and saw that the entire barn had been reduced to a pile of smoldering rubble overnight. Fire trucks had been called in a few hours before, and they had dumped several thousand gallons of water on it all in vain. I learned later on that my stepmother had left early that morning, and my oldest stepbrother saw the smoke as he went out to his car for work. Everything that was in that barn burned. The fire burned so hot that when one of the tires on one of the lawnmowers blew, it was sent through the opposing wall of the barn. I was the only person who didn't have some personal items stored in that barn. I was also the only person who slept through 3 fire trucks rolling onto the property, sirens blaring, and dumping thousands of gallons of water onto the ground less than 60 yards from my bedroom window. I am also a notoriously light sleeper, to the point where I will wake up to the vibration from my phone alarm going off before it even starts playing a chime. People walking upstairs has been enough to wake me before. Later on, one of our new neighbors, neighbor is in quotes because the nearest house is around half-mile away, told us that he knew we would have a fire because everyone on this particular road has at some point. Other sounds have kept me up at night before at this house. There is a distinct whistling sound that I have heard on several occasions super early in the morning, coming from deep in the woods near our property. My youngest stepbrother has also heard it before. When he did, he walked out of the house at close to 3 a.m. with a headlamp, a rifle, and his dog Ozzy. He looked for hours and saw nothing. His dog, however, had to be taken to a vet less than a week later when he started coughing up blood. This happened after Susie had lung cancer, so the same symptoms happening to both of them was not lost on me. The whistling that can be heard at night is usually a sign that I have stayed up a little too late. Something really strange happens here at around 3 a.m. It becomes completely quiet, so quiet at times that the only sounds I can hear are my own breathing and heartbeat. It is around these times when I will feel something about this house come to life. Whatever it is, I am terrified of meeting it. If I realize that I am still up and around at 3, I scramble into bed and pretend to be asleep. I will feel hot breath on my face and smell that same rancid, rotting meat smell. It will scratch at my door and occasionally my arms, sometimes leaving marks and sometimes not. The worst part, though, is the whispers. It will whisper in my ear in a soft tone, telling me things that my now ex would say, that my uncle would say, that my mom would say. I ignore it and pretend to be asleep, though I think it knows that I'm not. When I wake up the next morning, everything will be the same. I am convinced that whatever this thing is, it is the cause of the whistling, the crashes, the fire, the animals dying, everything. I can't wait to move out at the end of the year.